Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to be walking you through some possible solutions for a selection of questions in sections 10-1, 10-2, 10-3, and 10-4. Let's get started. The first question we're going to go over is question 3 from section 10-1. And this question says, what DJ's on-demand D playlist items song IDs have the same event ID as song ID 45? So, in our select statement, we're going to be selecting from the D playlist items table, and we're going to be selecting the song IDs. And for this question, we're going to be using a subquery, and we're going to be using that subquery to determine which song IDs have the same event ID as song ID 45. So, we'll start with our select statement. So we want to know which song IDs match these specifications. So we're going to select song ID, and we're selecting from the D playlist items table. And then for our where statement, we're selecting where the event ID is equal to this subquery that we're going to write. And the subquery is going to go in parentheses, and it's going to look just like a regular SQL query. So the subquery is going to be selecting the event ID from the D playlist items table. And because we only want the event ID that is the event ID for song ID 45, we have where song ID equals 45. So we'll go ahead and go into Apex and run our code and see what happens. So I've copied our code into Apex, and we'll go ahead and run it. And what you should see here is a list of song IDs. Now, we've got 3 song IDs here. If you want to double check to make sure that your code is right, you can just add event ID to your select statement and run your code again. And they should all have the same event ID because the event ID is supposed to match the event ID for song ID 45. And they are all the same song ID, or event ID. So this is what your results should look like when you run your code for this question. You should have these 3 song IDs. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next question. The next question we're going to go over is question 9 from section 10-1. And this question reads, which Oracle employees have the same department ID as the IT department? So we know that we want to select from the employees table when we write our select statement. And we're going to use a subquery for this question. So we know that in our subquery, we're going to be working with the department ID, and we're going to be working with the department name of IT. So we're going to need to use the department name column as well. So we'll start by writing our select statement. And this doesn't give us very much information about whether we want to, what parts of the employee information we want to select. So for the purposes of this question, we're just going to select first name and last name from the employees table. You could add employee ID in there. It just depends on the context of why they need this information. And so for our where statement, we're going to have where department ID is equal to our subquery. And again, our subquery is going in parentheses, but then it has the same structure as a regular SQL query. And we're going to be selecting the department ID from the departments table. And we want to only select the department ID that is the same as the IT department ID. So we'll have our where department name equals IT, so that we're only selecting the IT department ID. So at the end of when we run this statement, we should only get the employee names of employees that have that IT department's department ID. So we'll go ahead and go into Apex and run our code. We've got our code here in Apex. And what should happen when we run this is that we only get those employees with the same department ID as the department of the IT department. So we'll run the code. And we've got a list of names. We've got 3 people on our list. Now, just running the code like that, we can't be 100% sure that that's completely right. You can always go up into your object browser to see if the what the IT department's department ID is, and you can just add department ID to your select statement, and the department ID should be the same for all 3 of these people, and it's department ID 60, and that is the IT department's department ID. So this should be what your results look like when you run your code for this question. The next question we're going to go over is question 2 from section 10-2. And this question reads, write a query to return all those employees who have the same job ID as Raj's and were hired after Davies. So we know that we're going to be using the employees table. We're going to be selecting from there. And for our subqueries that we're going to write, we want to write a subquery that consolidates the job ID of Raj and the hire date that is after Davies. So those are what our subquery is going to differentiate out. So we're going to start with our select statement. Again, we don't know what the context of this is, so for the purposes of this question, we're just going to select first name and last name from the employees table. You could add employee ID or any other information that you think is important. And then we're going to have the where statement, and we're going to have 2 subqueries for this question. So we'll start with the first part. We're going to have where job ID is equal to this first subquery. And because we want to select the job ID that is the same as Raj, we're going to have select job ID from employees, and then we'll have that where statement for the last name that is equal to Raj, so that we can select the employees that have that same job ID. And then we'll have an and after that subquery, and we will have the hire date that is greater than, which means after in this case, and then our second subquery. And so our second subquery will be selecting the hire date from the employees table, and we want the hire date to be after Davies' hire date. So we'll have where last name is equal to Davies. So again, these 2 subqueries are going to be helping us select employees who have the same job ID as Raj and were hired after Davies. So we'll go ahead and go into Apex and run our code and see what we get. Okay, so I've got our code copied into Apex, and we'll go ahead and run it. And what you should see when you run this code in your results panel, you should have two entries. You should have Randall Matos and Peter Vargas in these results. And if you're not sure about whether these match, you can always go into the object browser through the SQL workshop to see if they match the criteria for the question. We can also go in here and add job ID to the select statement to make sure that the job ID is at least the same, because it should have the same job ID as Raj. And we can see down here that it is the same job ID. So this should be the results that you see when you run your code for this question. So we'll go ahead and move on. The last question we're going to go over in this video is question 10 from section 10-3. And this question reads, write a non-pairwise subquery listing the last name, first name, department ID, and manager ID for all employees that have the same department ID and manager ID as employee 141. Okay, so the first thing that we need to notice about this question, what it's asking us to do, is that we want to write a non-pairwise subquery, which means that even if we're comparing multiple columns, we're going to write a separate subquery for each column that we need to do a comparison for, because we want to compare them one at a time. Next, we know that we need to select last name, first name, department ID, and manager ID. So that's what's going to go into our select statement. And we're selecting from the employees table. And we only want to select employees that have the same department ID and manager ID as employee for 141. So those are going to be our subqueries, is determining whether the department ID is the same as employee 141 and the manager ID is the same as employee 141. So we'll start with our select statement. So our select statement is just going to be really simple, selecting these items that we're told to select in the prompt. So select last name, first name, department ID, manager ID. Super simple, selecting from the employees table, of course. Now for our first subquery, we're going to be using a where statement. And we're going to have the we're selecting department IDs that are the same as employee 141, but just in case there's a null value in the department ID column, we are going to use this NVL function to read the department IDs and just give it a department ID that wouldn't exist in case, so that would be -1 in this case, in case any of them don't have department IDs. And then we're going to use this in statement, and then we're going to have our subquery in the parentheses, and it's going to be select, and then again the NVL, so that we can handle the null values, department ID, and then again -1 for a department ID that wouldn't exist. And then we're selecting from the employees table, and we want to only select employees where the employee ID is in 141. So we want it to be 141. And then, so that's your first subquery. And the second subquery is going to look like this. So we're going to add an and again, we're going to use this NVL for the manager ID, and then we're going to use in, and then inside the parentheses, our subquery is select, and then again, this NVL for the manager ID and we're selecting from the employees table still, and we're only selecting where the employee ID is in 141. So we want the employee ID to be the same as employee 141 again. So we'll go ahead and go into Apex and run our code and see what we get. So I've copied our code into Apex, and because we are selecting these entries based on the department ID being the same as employee 141 and the manager ID being the same as employee 141, the values in the department ID and manager ID columns should be the same for every entry that shows up. And if not, we know that we've done something wrong. So we'll go ahead and run this code, and we'll look at the results. We see that the department ID that we're seeing is department ID 50, and the manager ID we're seeing is manager ID 124. And if you go into the object browser, you can go and double check to make sure that employee ID 141 has these values matching. And so when you run your code for this question, this is the output that you should see. I hope that this video was helpful to you. Have a great rest of your day, and thanks for watching.